Hello, everyone. Hopefully you can hear me. We're going to give a minute for people to sort of sign on. I'm seeing the attendees roll in right now. And I want to give people a chance to hopefully make sure their audio settings are working. Last time we had a couple people who didn't have their audio quite connected. So before we get started, we'll give people a minute here to make sure they can hear me talking. So we'll put a comment in the chat. Just make sure if you can't hear audio, check your audio settings. And we'll just give it a minute or so here before we get started. I guess I ought keep talking to make sure that people can actually hear me. Okay, yeah. Okay. All righty. Okay, we are at 6:02, so hopefully everyone's audio is working and we can get rolling. Thank you all for joining us tonight for our third and final virtual town hall meeting to discuss Memphis Animal Services' future plans of shifting to a community-supported sheltering model to better serve the citizens and pets in the city of Memphis and surrounding. I am pleased tonight to be joined by a very special guest, and I might gush a bit because this is a guy that has really been a personal mentor to me along my journey, and that is Mark Peralta, Chief Programs Officer for Best Friends Animal Society. I will just briefly talk about Mark and then introduce him and let him speak on his own behalf. But when I first took this position at Memphis Animal Services, myself and Katie Pemberton attended the Best Friends Conference in Atlantic City, New Jersey. And we didn't know anyone, and we were sort of, the young newcomers, and we're really trying to navigate this world of municipal sheltering. And I went to a presentation, and Mark, back then, I think you were just about to take over as the Mid-Atlantic Regional Director. And he presented in a session, and I sat and listened with like my eyes just wide open, gaping, listening, and said, this is a guy that I need in my world. So after the session, I was one of those people, I ran right up to him and said, Mark, I'm Alexis and I'm in Memphis. And he said, well, I'm taking over the Mid-Atlantic and Memphis is on my radar. And sure enough, he came all the way from that attic in Rhode Island where he is right now and came on down to Memphis Animal Services and spent time with us and even pulled a dog from us while he was there as part of his senior rescue that he and his wife run. So this is a guy that has been a mentor to me, has been inspirational to me through my journey. And so I'm so honored to have him here today to lend really national perspective to this conversation, because the conversation we're having right now here tonight is something that's happening in cities across the country. So Mark, thank you for being here, and please share a few words, because I'm just so pleased that you're here tonight.
Thanks, Alexis, and thanks for the kind words. And I am really excited to be here. I bet y'all didn't know that Best Friends considers Memphis the Mid-Atlantic, but that is y'all are the western border. But we're pretty loose with our geographic qualifications. But it was true, and I love Memphis, and I actually grew up in North Little Rock, Arkansas. So I spent quite a bit of time in Memphis in my childhood, and I'm really proud to be working with Memphis. As Alexis said, I'm the Chief Program Officer, so I work in communities all over the country, mostly in the South, a lot in Texas, Louisiana, Arkansas, Tennessee as well, and really happy to help explain, help broaden, and as Alexis said, give a little bit of the national perspective of other cities and how they're talking about this. This is not a Memphis solely conversation. It's happening in a lot of different places. We're all looking at COVID. What we can learn, what we can take away, and how we progress as a community to help save animals in the best way possible. So thank you for letting me be here, Alexis, and I'm happy to be talking to all y'all.
Great. All right. Well, we're going to dig right in, folks. We're just going to go through a couple of brief slides to just provide some overview in case some of you weren't able to sort of dig in to a lot of the resources that we put out on the website. And then we're going to dive into questions that you all submitted in advance of this presentation, of this town hall, so we can have a robust discussion and make sure we're addressing the questions and concerns that our community has. So Katie, if you would advance the slide for us. What we're talking about today is community supported sheltering. What does that mean? That means that we are going to combine traditional animal control functions. Those aren't going anywhere, but we're going to add a layer. This is an additive service of community supported sheltering. And the idea is that the community supported sheltering serves as the proactive tool to address this issue, whereas traditional animal control really serves a reactive function. So it's trying to get our hands completely around the problem rather than focusing so much on the back end reactive end of it. Next slide, Katie. So it's a model that supports the human-animal bond. And some of you may have seen this word tossed around, this acronym HAS, Human Animal Support Services. And it's really a methodology that a lot of national animal welfare groups and shelters are embarking upon to try to help build plans that focus on this idea that the human-animal bond is something we all need to be focused on every day in our work, and that keeping pets with their owners or keeping pets in the communities where they're found to hopefully enable reunification with their owners, that these should be the tenets of what we do. These should be our priorities, and our priorities shouldn't be so much on how do we take this animal away from where it is and find it a new place to go, but it's about supporting within that neighborhood, whether it's a pet in a owned home or a pet that's lost its way that needs to get back home. Next slide, Katie. Of course, this helps keep pets out of the shelter unless they absolutely need to be there. And any of you on this town hall today that has been to our shelter and seen the grief on our faces on those tough days, or who's felt that grief personally, knowing that we've had to make horrific decisions to kill animals for space, I hope you can value that keeping pets out of the shelter, unless that is the only place for them to go, is a win for us across the board, and certainly a win for the pets of our community. Next slide, Katie. So what does this community supported sheltering program look like? Well, what it looks like is really building up almost like a caseworker approach, a social services approach to animal welfare, by us looking at the data, identifying what are the reasons that people are having to give up their pets. And also, what are the reasons that we think some of these pets are ending up stray, lost, and abandoned? What are all the reasons that pets are ending up within the animal welfare system in our community? And trying to directly address those particular issues. So spay and neuter, we all know that that's so critically important. We've started doing the first Monday of every month, we're paying for Spay Memphis to do 30 large breed adult dog spays and neuters free of charge for people in our low-income neighborhoods. It is our bill, they pay not a cent. And increasing that access to free spay and neuter is critical. What about dog houses? So animals that do live outside have adequate housing. Fence repair, this is a huge one. If an animal keeps getting out and running loose, well, certainly there must be a containment issue. So can we provide assistance there? Is it a behavior and training issue? Is this an issue of veterinary care? I mean, you know, our average cost per animal in the shelter is about $300 when you factor in all the underlying administrative costs. If I can pay for a pet to have medical care at an off-site veterinary clinic, and now that person has a veterinary relationship and that pet stays in home, that's a win for us, and it saves taxpayer dollars. We just got a grant for pet deposits. So we're now helping to pay for pet deposits or temporary boarding for people with housing insecurity, which we know is absolutely going to be a huge issue for all of us moving forward, particularly as the eviction moratorium potentially expires come January. And then another part of this program is assistance for a found pet. So since the dawn of time, people have been finding pets and either getting them back to their owners or finding them new homes. That's not new. This has never been work exclusively conducted through the path of the shelter. But the assistance for those people wasn't really formalized. It wasn't there. So we've put a greater support system into place so that if you find a pet and you're willing to be that person, that we're going to support you all along the way with all the resources so that your good deed and your service does not cause you financial harm, and that we provide you all the benefit of our infrastructure and resources. And then finally, if a pet parent does need to rehome, then we're going to provide rehoming assistance through this program. Next slide, Katie. So here's a couple of frequently asked questions we're going to highlight, and then we'll move into your viewer submitted or audience submitted questions. This to me is the most critical slide to present today. And I'm going to ask Mark to talk about this a little bit because when he and I chatted prior to us beginning today, he indicated that this is a point of confusion that is happening across the country. We went into emergency intake response based on best practices protocols from the National Animal Care and Control Association, and that directive is still in place today. So I think it's so important to distinguish a COVID response from what we're talking about with community supported sheltering, which is a long-term tool or program that is going to help us be successful long-term. But these are not the same thing. Us not picking up healthy strays en masse like we used to is not a tenet of community supported sheltering. It is a tenet of an emergency response plan that we had to take. And I want to talk briefly about why. Those of you on this call who have been at Memphis Animal Services on a Saturday know this. If we had not adjusted what we did, we would have been a super spreader event and people would have died because of us. Our Saturdays were a Black Friday at Walmart. We had wall-to-wall people. If we had not, and remember, much of this predated even a mask ordinance. If we had not taken action, we would have put our citizens at risk. We would have put our staff at risk. And we would have potentially lost our entire workforce due to quarantines and had no one left to care for the animals in our building. And I give a specific example of that. In our veterinary clinic, we have split into two teams, an A team and a B team, a vet on each team. Had we not done that, we've had 2 positives in our clinic. In both of those circumstances, there would have been crossover on teams and we would have had no veterinarian for 2 weeks, twice, which would have shut down our medical operations. We wouldn't have been able to do rabies vaccines. Animals that needed us medically would have had nowhere to go. So keeping that workforce continuity for pets has been critical. And I think it's important to also remember that as we had to phase back how many humans could come in our building, this is a disease that thrives on crowds of people going to one place. We had to stop crowds of people coming to one place. And what did that mean? To responsibly manage that, we had to limit how many animals we took in to make sure that we could match intakes and outcomes, or else many, many hundreds of animals would have died in our shelter because of this. So Mark, if you wouldn't mind expanding a little bit on this and just some things that you've talked about at the national level, but I can't emphasize enough that I can't wait for COVID to be over. I can't wait to not have split teams. I can't wait to get out of emergency intake, but it's not there now. And Memphis has seen spikes over the past week, as have many communities around the country. And we have to factor in human safety when we are operating.
Yeah, I think that's really well put. And I also want to just say from a national perspective, and one of my jobs is to go into communities and help, whether they're government agencies or private organizations, really figure out the secret sauce on how to be community supported sheltering before even COVID happened. Because really, we only get to the success that we need. We don't always want to be a reactive government service for you. We want our civil servants and our officers and our teams in the government there to be able to go out and proactively help people to keep their pets. And that's always been, and including in Memphis, something that we wanted to continue to push out nationally. Obviously, it's always that secret sauce that Alexis talked about. We don't want to overwhelm the amount of animals that we have in a shelter to the staff that can adequately take care of them. And we certainly don't want to have unnecessary deaths happening in our shelter. And our end goal is to save every animal that can get out, whether it's Memphis or anywhere in the country. Obviously, when COVID hit, Memphis, everywhere else, that was a real deal issue that we all faced in cities all over the country of, now we've got to make sure that we're still there for our communities. We're going to have to go to emergency because now we're shifting and having A, B, and C staffs, to make sure that we're not spreading, that we're keeping ourselves safe. We spent a lot of time as a national movement to make sure that we were deemed essential workers in a lot of cities all over. But that also meant keeping ourselves safe, making sure we're doing right by the animals in our community. And the communities all over have stepped up to really help people like you. And that's kind of what we need. But doing just emergency sheltering is not the end goal for this. Community supported sheltering really is. And the difference being is there is still a number of animals that enter shelters that it's maybe not be the best place for them if we do some different things to get proactive and get on the front end to help these people keep their animals. But the shelter is certainly a good and quality place for a lot of animals. that can get back in when we have that ratio to be able to properly take care of them, because it's not just going to pick them up and keeping them like a collection dish in a building. We really need to make sure that they're being amply taken care of, that the staff are able to keep up, and that we're getting them out alive. And no matter pre-COVID, during COVID, or after COVID, we really need as a community to work better together, because there is so many animal issues that we're trying to face, but it is not keeping and not taking in any more animals. That's almost going back to a pound mentality if all we're taking in are emergencies, and that's not what we want. That's not what we want anywhere. But we do want to make sure that we're doing the best by the animals and the people that we're serving, and figuring out the best way for either animals to stay in their homes before they have to go to the shelter, or utilize our wonderful shelter systems to take care of those pets and get them and find them a new home.
Yeah. Katie, next slide, please. So that brings us to this very key question that we get asked all the time: is MAS not picking up strays anymore? Well, that is absolutely incorrect. And in fact, I can tell you, looking at our intake kennels every day, that is incorrect. First off, I would say any call that comes in through the 545 COP system where there's any indication that either the animal poses a public safety risk or has any sort of medical, urgent medical injury or illness, we never for 1 second stopped going on those calls and impounding those animals. That portion of our operating plan never changed once and never will change. What we did do was, in response to best practices guidance and a world of uncertainty, I can't speak enough to the fact that, think about how unsure you were at the beginning when we all went into stay-at-home orders and all of these things. We looked to what can we do now, and that was the guidance that was coming down to us, was we should not be at that time out there rounding up all these healthy stray animals, right? So the idea being that that is a COVID response, but the idea on this is that we will still pick up all the strays if they still need us to pick them up and bring them to the shelter. We will still go on those calls. We just may not end up with a shelter impound at the end of that call. And let me give a couple examples that I think really sum up why this model, and so, Mark touched on the idea of being an emergency room and a community resource hub. There's going to be other animals coming in our shelter. They're there right now that don't meet that emergency room criteria. But it's because they went through the community supported sort of sifting program. We weren't able to find an alternate resource, and they did come to us. But I'm going to give you some examples. One of my officers told me this just this week, that at least 5 times that she could think of off the top of her head in the past month, she went on a stray call, took possession of the animal, and what she would have done before, scanned it for a microchip. They all have scanners, no microchip, put it on the truck. Well, because of this policy that we've been sharing with them and teaching them, she walked up and down the street with it and knocked on doors. And she said at least 5 times that she could think of, she knocked on a door and the person came to the door and said, "That's my dog." And she was able to hand the dog back to the person and work with that individual to get them into compliance through our free spay and neuter, through our fence repair, whatever the reason that those pets got loose in the first place, or just lack of knowledge. She was able to work with them. And I'd like you to think about the converse, okay? So let's say we had just taken that dog and brought it to the shelter and never known who that owner was. That owner is more than likely going to source another pet, perhaps from a neighbor down the street. They've learned nothing about expectations, spay and neuter, ordinance compliance, anything like that. And so now we have to go back and catch their next dog and their next dog and their next dog. So this is about addressing the people part of this problem if we can make contact with the person who is a part of this problem. If we can't, if we've tried, if the finder, if the person who found the dog can't keep it to foster, then the pet comes to the shelter. But we owe it to ourselves and to these animals to try those extra steps in the field, because it's better for the pet than being in a kennel at the shelter. It's better for your taxpayer dollars. It saves money. It's better for shelter capacity so we can spend more time on these outreach programs. There's just a myriad of reasons why this is a better solution. And it's about us just trying a few extra things instead of just blindly saying impound, impound. We can't be the dog catcher. If we're the dog catcher, we're in a cycle we've been in for 100 years. We have to be caseworkers and community advocates, and that's what this is about. Next slide, please, Katie. So this is another one we hear, Mark. There are more strays on the street than ever. Well, our data that we've been monitoring and collecting doesn't support that. We've been monitoring calls for service. Strays are down 31%, aggressive strays down 10%, bite reports down 23%, dead animal pickup calls down 10%. And I know that sometimes there are questions asked of, well, the community knows that you're not picking anything up, so they're not calling. Well, that's actually not true, because we've never stopped going on stray aggressive calls. So there would never have even been a call to, or a belief that we weren't going on those, and yet those still went down. And there's a lot of data out there. And Mark, I would ask if you could speak to any of this. There's been all these studies that I'm reading that I would love to replicate here in Memphis. San Antonio, for example, that did this great study where they went out and they were able to determine with a pretty high degree of accuracy, 95% through this study methodology, that 87 to 96% of free roaming dogs at any given time have homes to go back to. That Dallas tracks location where a pet is picked up to the address where the owner lives that reclaims that pet, and most dogs are picked up within 1,000 feet of their home. So it's this idea that I know social media sometimes, because of exposure bias and that echo chamber effect, makes us think that there are more strays on the street, but I think sometimes it's because people are talking about it more. But our data doesn't support it, and I think that there's some really great studies that I hope we can replicate here that support the notion that those pets probably went home. They went out for a walk and then they went back home. Mark, any comments on that?
No, I would reiterate that as well. It's been something that we've talked about, and I think Dallas is a really good example of that. And if anybody knows anything about Dallas, they, especially about 4 years ago, had a really terrible incident where there was a mauling and there was a death. So they got extremely diligent, because none of us want to see that happen. That's unfortunate. And it was around an area of Dallas that has a large number of reported stray and roaming dogs. And even in the times of COVID, obviously the fear of what's going to happen now that we're on emergency, now that they were doing limited intake, the same stuff that we were, was happening in Memphis. And, their director, as Alexis pointed out, was really, all over this and tracking it, because we don't want to see that ever happen again. And everything that Alexis just pointed out, I don't know why I keep calling you Alexa. I think it's because I talk to my stereo.
I'm like the Amazon thing in your house. It happens a lot, trust me.
But the point being is, studies, whether it's El Paso, Tulsa, Edinburgh, which is down far south Texas, San Antonio, a lot of these places, Las Cruces, New Mexico, all of them have found out to exactly what Alexis is saying, that most of these lost dogs are found within blocks or well within a mile of where they live. And if we can do just a little bit more, they are owned pets. I'm Native American, and I grew up in off of a reservation, and had a grandmother that grew up on a reservation. And the way that we owned our dogs was they would go out and they would roam around to go feed. It doesn't mean that they weren't owned. So some of it is really just kind of trying to bring more resources, more understanding, the things that Alexis talked about before. Some of them don't have fences. Maybe they, it's really getting out there and being proactive to kind of help, limit these amount of stray animals. But the fact of the matter is, when you really look at the data, true unowned stray and roaming, roaming dogs are minimal. They are owned, and they're usually owned within the area that they're found in. So to Alexis's point that she was pointing out, if you're just going by the law and you're just going up, picking up these dogs, taking them back, rather than doing a few things, talking, finding out, or helping somebody that's finding this animal from the neighborhood, because that dog is from that neighborhood. It's going to save taxpayer dollars. It's going to save us time. It's going to help animal services prioritize to cruelty cases, bite investigations, and everything else that they're doing. And we're being a better service to our community to not only get that dog back home, but find out what are some of these patterns of why these animals are roaming out, owned or not, so we can start to limit that. And those are the kind of things that you're seeing in places like San Antonio and Dallas that have huge numbers of animals that roam free, owned, but are roaming free on a daily basis.
Yep. Thank you, Mark. Next slide, Katie, and then we're going to move into attendee questions. This is the last one. I just think it's important, you know, Mark's here on this call today. I had Gina Knepp on our first call from the Found Animals Foundation, which is our microchip company, and she's on the Haas executive committee. But everybody's talking about this. And one final thing I would say before we go into the questions is, I know there's fear and people are skeptical about all of this, and there's some confusion with the COVID emergency response and this, like we started this off talking about. But I would ask the community to think for just a second. What did you ask Mayor Strickland to do when he took office? What did you ask me to do when I was put into this role? And it was to get unsiloed, to listen to progressive animal sheltering policies that are coming out around the country, to engage with consultants like Target Zero and Best Friends and other national organizations that are leading the charge, that are pushing us towards No Kill 2025. And we did every one of those things. And every single program we've put into place, everything we've done has been something that someone told me to do, I learned to do, I trained to do. These are all things that were coming from the exact same people and the exact same resources that are telling us that this is the path now. And so I find it very difficult to suddenly turn my back on these experts that have led us so far, that have taken us from where we were to where we are now. And I had someone pose an interesting conundrum to me the other day. They said, isn't it ironic that 4 years ago, all the talk on social media was don't take animals to Memphis Animal Services because they'll kill them. And now all the talk on social media is we want to take more animals to Memphis Animal Services. Please don't stop taking them. So I guess that says we've done something right along the way. But I would ask for a little bit of trust and belief that we all want the same outcomes here. I do not want homeless stray dogs wandering around the streets, suffering and dying and being hit by cars. I do not want packs of dogs threatening our citizens or causing injury to pets or people. No one on our team wants that. But what we want to do is follow best practices and get out of the vicious cycle of doing it the same way over and over again to no result, to not fixing the problem, to not reducing the issue. I want to do the very best thing that I can do to address this problem. And I truly believe that the national leaders would never steer us elsewhere. They're going to tell us what they, because we all want the same thing. And so I would just ask, as questions come in and as we go through them, please do keep in mind that if there's a better idea out there, we're all ears. All I do is listen and learn and attend and read and try to do the very best thing I can for this community. And that's what our team does. And so please keep that in mind as we go through, that this is about us wanting to achieve the same goal. We just got to figure out how to get in alignment about that path to get there. Okay. All right. I'm going to move on to questions now. Katie, if you wouldn't mind, would you read the first question for us?
Yes. Number one, how will this new model reduce the euthanasia
Excuse me,
Katie,
yes. I'm so sorry. Would you mind speaking up just a little? It's just a little bit challenging to hear you.
Yes. How will this new model reduce the euthanasia rate of healthy adoptable dogs and cats at MAS? Could you hear that?
Yeah, I absolutely did. And that's a fantastic question, because it's something, honestly, through this whole conversation that we're not talking about enough, is the fact that that is the sweet spot of this plan. Not only are we hopefully going to improve what's happening out in the community, but by us doing that filtering system, by us saying, let's let the shelter not be the first stop, but the last resort for some of these pets that don't need the professional intervention of a shelter, by us filtering that out even slightly, it allows us to overcome that remaining gap that we have struggled with. You know, we ended euthanasia for space for cats 4 years ago this November. We ended euthanasia for space for small breed dogs and puppies 3 years ago. Large breed adult dogs, we've just been so close, but not quite there. And so we have not euthanized a dog for space since March, since before this went into effect. And I told my team, I never want to go back there. I never want that to happen again. So that's the first point. When it comes to like a true space euthanasia, this is the solution, because it keeps us from being in that upside down math problem of where we had this many come in, but we need this many to go out, not quite that many. We've got that gap. But maybe more importantly is there's a segment of our population, particularly with these large breed adult dogs, that I would call bubble dogs, right? So they don't have necessarily like a documented dangerous dog history, but they're exhibiting concerning behavior in the shelter. They're forward-facing, reactive at their kennel reactive, or they can't go to play group because they're getting in fights with other dogs. These are dogs that don't need to die if they can get the help and resources they need. But when you're in a churn, when every day the building's on fire and you're just trying to get through that day until the officers come in so you can do it all over again, how could we ever spend the time to really try to get some specialized placement for those dogs, to work with them on site? So that cushion is going to allow not just space euthanasia to go away, but I think it's going to take some of those animals that have been caught in this bubble behavior category and give them a chance. And that's really exciting to me. Mark?
Yeah, just to add to that, especially with Memphis and those bubble dogs that Alexis is referring to, you have a great animal services, and I'm saying that with all sincerity. I visit animal shelters across the country. I love what's happening in Memphis. I love what you're doing as a community. That being said, those are the dogs that struggle the most in the environments that we've created for them in an animal shelter. And it doesn't matter how wonderful the staff are, which they are, how wonderful the volunteers are, which they are, but by utilizing different ways of making sure that we could potentially stop these animals from coming to the doors, potentially the ones that really could use the help, but they can stay with the families that already love them. It might be a couple of months of food, it might be a spay and neuter, it might be a dog house, a fixed yard. Those animals aren't coming in, and it's always a resource game, like Alexis said. It's reworking, having a little bit more time and effort to really figure out a quicker way of getting those animals that really struggle, because to Alexis's point, it's just sometimes getting them out of an environment that is, built through a lot of love, but is really stressful for them. And you're trying to find other ways to prevent them from getting in that environment, which causes us a lot of it's a lot of resource and it's a lot of hard work to try to get them out. You all know, but these animals deserve to live a life, and we have to evolve. Every business has to evolve. If we run a business like we ran 100 years ago, which is a lot of how we run animal shelters, we are never going to get to the goals that we want. This is a step forward that we've been talking about for decades on the national scale. You guys have really amplified in Memphis this work. And yes, COVID kind of threw it to a different area that showed that the community will step up, but this is not the end result of what we want. And Alexis continues to say that. We just want to put some proactive resources in place and to get the community more involved to help prevent dogs that we already know will struggle in this environment, to get ultimately to our goals where we are only truly euthanizing. Those are animals that are dangerous. Those are animals that are sick and suffering and that have a poor prognosis. That is a good thing. That's something that we have to continue to do, but we want to stop, needless death of animals that simply just should not be in shelters, and that we might have other different opportunities to be able to get them a live outcome and do it in a safe way and keep families together, especially in times like now. The worst thing you could do is lose a family member. If I'm losing a job or I'm struggling, and if somebody can provide me help, that is the right thing to do by our community. And it's a different kind of work, and it's scary to change, but these are the kind of things that we have to do as a movement to evolve, to save lives and get to our goals.
100%. Katie, next question, please.
What are the projections for the amount of time it will take to make Memphis a euthanasia-free city?
So I think that's an important word that we need to just dig into. And I can see Mark shaking his head because I've heard him give presentations on this. Euthanasia is something that we're never trying to get rid of, because euthanasia is the humane, compassionate ending to either the suffering of an animal medically or an animal that poses such a public safety risk that we can't responsibly place them. What we are doing is trying to work towards the ending of killing of healthy shelter pets. And so we've really steered clear of the word killing here locally, because I feel like it is such a hard thing to assign to staff who were assigned to go into the euthanasia room. And so I made a choice to not go there. But now that this is on the table and we're talking about it, that's the difference here. We are there because of COVID intake. I think we can stay there if we as a community commit to this idea of community supported sheltering and not go back to that place where we were killing for space. And I think that we can stop killing animals that have behavior issues. We've really dug in on medical, and I'll say that. If an animal is being euthanized for medical, it's being euthanized for medical that is justifiable. We've dug into treatable medical, but behaviorally, we haven't yet, like we just talked about in the last question. So this is about moving in that direction to the point where we can really look and say that every single dog that was euthanized truly met the definition of humane euthanasia. So
yeah, and just to highlight that, I would agree from an outside perspective, you all were there, this close to being there before everything in COVID happened. And it was really those dogs, the bubble dogs that Alexis was talking about. So now that you've had COVID, now that you've had the emergency intake process that shelters all across the country have been doing, you've been there. And this is the step to keep you there, but to do it in a way where the shelter is able to bring in more animals that need them, but also can get out and be proactive. So I would agree. I think you're there. And the key is what can you as a community do to change a little bit what we've learned from COVID, to evolve and really put a stake in the ground and say, this community supported model is the next evolution to make sure that we don't backslide.
Okay. And we're going to move on to a different topic now. Katie, next question.
Yeah. How are you deterring dog flipping?
Dog flipping. So I think that, our best practices for deterring dog flipping, and if by dog flipping, we're talking specifically about the idea of someone coming into the shelter and getting a pet for a reduced price adoption fee and then selling it for a higher price online, our specific efforts around that would relate to our data observation and what we try to do in terms of tracking individuals coming in. So anyone who has a lifetime history of adopting more than 4 pets just requires a quick supervisor review. We almost always say yes because their circumstances, some of those pets have passed away, but we do keep an eye on that. We have not found it to be at least a pervasive problem within the shelter environment at Memphis Animal Services. And I also think it's important that we're really clear about what dog flipping is and what the intent and goal is. One thing I've learned through a lot of this, Mark, and I would love your perspective on this as well, because I haven't dug into this topic very much at all, but trusting people is something that's such a core tenet of what we're talking about. One of the other big conversations at the national animal welfare level is this idea of inclusion and diversity in our movement and not putting up roadblocks to adoption with long adoption applications and arbitrary barriers like yard checks and fence checks and all of these kind of things. And because it comes down to the idea of trusting people. We have to trust people because we cannot, the shelter is never going to solve this problem in our own little bubble. Like everything we do relies upon engagement from the community, donations, volunteers, adopters, fosters. So we try to look at something like this and say, is it possible that the person is trying to do the right thing and just maybe is kind of missing the mark on this? And maybe they thought they should charge that so they wouldn't get a bad person. I don't know. I just think that there's a lot to that, but certainly I would hope if anybody has a concern about something they're seeing, reach out to us and we'll do whatever we can to investigate and make sure that there's nothing nefarious going on. Anything to add, Mark?
I would just say, yeah, no, I think you hit a lot of the good points, and it's something, dog flipping or even people's concerns about, fee waived adoptions or promotional adoptions goes back to when you look at the data, and there's a lot of it because there is a lot of concern always about finding the right pet and finding the right home, but more times than not, and I would say 99 out of 100, it's true. We just have to get past some of our own, fears and sometimes control to trust the public. And I think COVID hopefully taught us a very big lesson as well as what the community is capable of when we are not able to provide the same kind of services and what people will do to make sure that pets are taken care of. There's numerous studies about, people don't want to come to shelters to flip dogs. They're on record with the city, and the stats just don't back that up. Does that not mean that anecdotally it can't happen here and here? And like Alexis said, the best thing that you can do is help be a watchful eye on those kind of things and inform your city shelter, because they will always do things to make sure that they're trying to brace that line between being overly judgmental for people that are coming in and trying to save and help an animal, but also, doing things like she described and just making sure that we're doing due diligence as a movement to just do that double check and make sure that there's not anything nefarious happening. But I will promise you all, looking at shelter stats and dealing with shelters all across the country, this is a fear in every single one of them. The data just doesn't play out. It doesn't happen as much as we think, and it doesn't mean it never happens, but it's very rare.
Yeah, and I mentioned it earlier. I think that so much of, I watched that documentary, The Social Dilemma. I don't know if folks have watched that, but it really opens your eyes to how careful you have to be about what you presume to be data that you're gathering on social media platforms. And that even if you just slow down on a post, Facebook captures that, and it's going to send you more content that it believes will keep you on the platform longer, because that's how Facebook makes money, is by selling your time and your eyes and your attention to companies. And so if it finds something that keeps you on there, so if you slow down about a cruelty situation or something that is bad, it's going to start sourcing that and finding as many of those stories as possible. So it's this idea of exposure bias. And that's why I think it's so important to stay in that world of stats and data and make sure that we are staying in that lane, because that's going to give us a more accurate picture than sort of the anecdotes of social media. Katie, next question.
How will not accepting unaltered, that's my kid, sorry. How will not accepting unaltered stray animals affect the growing homeless pet population? I was told by staff to leave a stray out.
Yeah, so certainly, and I understand that you heard that, because we said that during the height of our emergency COVID response. We were, again, it was uncharted times. I think we were doing that. Yeah. We've really moved past that now. And so now what the answer is that unaltered stray dog, what we're going to ask you now, if you made that same call now, is we're going to say, would you be willing to walk that dog up and down the street and see if you can find an owner? Would you be willing to hang some lost dog signs up? Would you be willing to foster this pet for us if we provide you a crate, food, spay neuter, vaccines? We'll put it on our website. We'll do all of this. And I just think it's so critically important that people remember that fostering saves lives. Those of you who are in rescue know this. We need fosters to do this. And so all we're doing is kind of shifting the idea of, you're already invested in this pet. You stopped and picked this pet up. You're invested in its success. So why don't I ask you to foster, instead of you bringing it to the shelter and then me going and finding some random stranger to foster that dog? It's about that sort of bird in hand. You're right there. You're a person. You obviously care. So let's try to match you right there at that point. And then in terms of those unaltered pets, I go back to that idea of, if we just grab that unaltered pet, we didn't talk to the owner who let that pet wander unaltered. And so they're going to have another one. But now, if we do this, if we shift to make sure that we're having those conversations, I can get that pet fixed, because we're doing it for free every Monday for members of or one Monday a month for members of the public. Like, we can do these things. That's our best opportunity to solve that problem. The minute I put that dog in a truck and drive it across the city an hour away, I've lost my best chance at making contact with that person and changing that behavior. So it's the moment is there. But yeah, we were saying you have to leave it there. That's not where we're at right now. Right now, we're really focused on engaging the citizen.
Yeah, and just to reiterate some of the stuff that we said earlier on this question is, almost all of these dogs are within blocks, if not within a mile of their home where they're found. So that is why it's ideal and important, instead of driving them back to a shelter. And if you think about it, if you lose a stray dog, the first thing that you're usually doing is you're going out, you're looking, you're trying to find your animal. And it's so much better and more effective for you to where you found that animal, is just to do a little bit of due diligence, have the shelter give you some tips, as Alexis is saying, and that's really important. And then also be able to provide potentially some resources within that community if that dog isn't altered, to kind of help them. But it's about the engagement, and it's about talking to them, because most of the time, if you're going to take that animal into a shelter, especially if you're half an hour away, you're really rolling the dice whether or not that animal's ever going to be reunited in its home. Memphis does a better job than nationally on return to owner rates, but return to owner rates, even with dogs, tend to be around 20%. And again, most of those animals, if not all of them, are owned. They're actually owned, and their owners are within those areas. So it's really important to say, how am I going to best effectively not only find that animal and get that animal back to its house, but also engage and help those parents, those pet parents, figure out ways where they're not, having unaltered animals running around the streets.
Katie, next question, please.
Okay, you've kind of already addressed this, Alexis, but question is, has it been considered that the number of stray animal calls is down because people realize no one is coming in those cases?
Yeah, so like I said before, I think that it is an overestimation that the people within the animal welfare community are a reflection of our overall community population in terms of their knowledge base. I mean, I still to this day have people ask me all the time if we're the place over on Farm Road, which is the Humane Society. I mean, people don't even know the difference between our organizations. And I just don't think that the average citizen has that level of knowledge to say, oh yeah, I heard that they have an intake policy shift and things like that. Not to mention the fact that if you call it in to 545 Cops, you are getting a live operator response 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, which was a shift we did in February pre-COVID, from you calling the shelter and potentially getting a voicemail from one dispatcher sitting in a room that we may get to a couple hours later because the calls keep coming in. So now you're getting this live person. They're putting the call in the system every time. We're responding, we're going on these. Could there be a few people that haven't called because of it? Of course there are. But one, I don't know how we would ever capture that data or that sort of rate of people who choose not to call. And two, I just don't know that it's reasonable to think that the 1 million people in the greater Memphis area or the 700,000 in the city of Memphis are all sort of in this place where they know all of these policies. I think that they're calling when they need to call, and in the vast majority of times we're going, so.
Yeah, and just to add to that, I would say, the complaints would be going up usually as well. And we certainly, as animal directors that work for the city, would definitely be getting that notification. And again, the one thing that I don't know that everybody in animal welfare, and I can't say specifically to Memphis, but when I oversaw animal services in the city of Philadelphia and in communities in Nevada and Colorado, I would say I think the average was 86% of our calls that we went out for stray animals were NAFs, which that means no animal found. So a lot of times we were going out and responding to this call because somebody saw a dog in their driveway, got there, and we couldn't find the animal anyway. So a lot of times, again, it's not usually the best, you're taking off a different call that might be a higher priority. It maybe isn't the best use of officer time or money spent for our city. And again, if they're calling and they're having a conversation with our dispatch, that dispatch can give them those tips that Alexis has already kind of talked about, and it's going to usually be a better outcome than having an officer always going out, especially in certain parts of the city. It could take them 45 minutes to an hour even to get out there, and who knows where that dog is at that time. So it's not even just about whether or not people are just giving up, because I completely agree, and nationally statistically backs up a lot of what Alexis is saying. But the other thing is again, what is our ultimate outcome here, and what are we really trying to do? We're trying to effectively help, bring good resources and information to our community members, and we're also trying to make sure that animal is not in danger and potentially can get back in a home and be contained safely. And that's usually the better way to do it.
Yeah, and just from a workflow standpoint, so this is how we handle those calls. So if someone calls for an aggressive dog, that call gets put in by the dispatcher and we're rolling, and we're probably getting there faster now than we were before. And we're looking at that data because we're not sort of bogged down with some of the lower priority calls. Secondly, if someone calls in for what we would call a priority for a stray roam, non-aggressive, non-injured, we don't do nothing. We call the person who called it in and we talk to them. Have you seen this dog before? Do you have any idea where the dog lives? Is there a certain time of day you see the dog? We're getting better info, because to Mark's point, if I have an officer that's in Whitehaven and they need to get, even within their same zone, down to South Memphis, with traffic, it might take them 20, 25 minutes, right? So that's a pretty good response time if they're ready to go. Well, 20 to 25 minutes is a long time in dog roaming land, and dogs run fast and they're gone by the time we get there. So we see that a lot. We call it an NLA, no loose animals. So the more we can make contact with the caller to try to build up, is this a pattern? Is this a dog? And another thing that we've done that I think has been really successful is working with police dispatch who takes the call. We ask them every single time, if someone's calling about a stray animal, you ask that caller if they know where the pet lives. And you would be shocked by just asking that question, how many times I monitor our calls all day, every day. You would be shocked how many in the comment box believes pet lives at this address, knows pet lives at this address, pet escaped from listed address, pet is loose from this house. And so again, it's harder it's different to have communication and conversations with our citizens, but it's more effective than blindly going about the work of being a dog catcher. Katie, I know we only have about 9 minutes left, so I want to make sure everybody that submitted a question at least gets one of their questions answered.
Okay, how can I, as a disabled senior with very little money and no transportation, do more to help the dogs?
Oh, well, that's a wonderful question, because we can find a way to work you in based on whatever your skill set is. We have work remotely opportunities for volunteers to help post lost dogs on Nextdoor. We're always looking for people to do that. We could send you photographs that our staff takes, better photos, and you could help share those on social media for us. If you'd be willing to foster a pet, let's say, how about a mom? We're having like this third kitten season. It's crazy. What about if we bring you a mom and a litter of kittens to your house to foster? There's so many things that you can do, and all we need to do is connect. All we need to know is that you're there and you're willing, and we'll find a way to make you a part of the solution. And it also comes outside of us. It's just talking to your neighbors, talking to your community, being an educator, being an advocate. The more we as a community, that's something that's been really cool about COVID, and why I actually think some of the call volume has gone down is because people are home and people are out walking and people are meeting their neighbors and people are meeting their neighbors' dogs. And so now if a dog is loose, somebody's like, oh yeah, I saw Bob walking that dog the other day. I know where it lives. We're getting back to this mindset that our neighborhood is a place that should be where problems are solved first before we involve government agencies. So you can be a local advocate in your neighborhood, or you can partner with us. We're happy to have you involved in any way possible. Katie?
Okay. There's three questions that are really similar, but basically it's just about is MAS planning to support rescues that are pulling dogs from the street instead of the shelter? Is there any monetary or support available for them? Will a portion of funds be transferred to rescues who are taking them, et cetera?
That's a great question, because it's absolutely something we think about and are trying to work on all the time. So first, I would like to say that if you look back historically at what our leadership team has done to support rescues, we've tried really hard to increase that level of support. I remember when I first started, the pull fees for rescues were like $50 per pet. And then I dropped that down to $20. And then this past January, I got rid of pull fees for rescues completely. And we were still offering, full medical for those pets. Now, did COVID change all of that? Of course it did. And again, I can only apologize so much for a pandemic, except to say, with a split veterinary clinic staff, they're at capacity on those two split teams with only one veterinarian, because they're still doing spay and neuter for in-house pets. They're still doing all the medical treatments, all those other things. But let me say this, when I don't have to be on COVID split schedules anymore, when we don't have to do that and I can have two veterinarians there and all my vet team there, we want to start doing at least one day a week where we book surgeries for rescue groups and we do all the bells and whistles, top to bottom, microchips, spay, neuter, whatever that looks like, medical support for dogs that are found that never step foot in our shelter system. We've actually also, on some of those Mondays, the Monday spay neuter days I talked about, if we don't fill all the spots, like our first one last month, we brought in All Fours Rescue Group, which is an outreach group in our community, and we gave them our extra spots. We actually gave a spot to, I think, one of the rescue groups that's on this call. We will do whatever we can, and it's not about not wanting to do it. I want to do it all. I want to spay and neuter everything. I want to give rescues everything free. You know, I want to do it all, but we have to keep capacity and resources in mind. It's not about money. It's about capacity and resources, but that's where we want to go for sure. And again, if we keep our population in-house lower, then my capacity in the clinic is lower, and then I have more capacity so that rescue doesn't have to go spend hundreds of dollars at private vet clinics, that we can be the rescue vet clinic, but we got to get there. And so it's a path towards that. It doesn't happen overnight, and it certainly can't happen under COVID restrictions, but that's where we're trying to go.
All right. Okay, the City of Memphis ordinance states that it shall be the duty of the administrator in charge of the city shelter to cause any animal other than fowl running at large to be apprehended and placed into the city shelter, and any dog running at large shall be apprehended and incarcerated in the city animal shelter. Please tell me how you're able to implement a policy with the stated intention of leaving non-aggressive and non-injured stray dogs on the streets given those ordinances. By doing so, are you not effectively disregarding your duty under the law? Would it not be better to first propose an amendment to the ordinances to grant you the discretion to pick and choose which dogs you impound? That way, the elected council members can have input in a policy change that directly affects their constituents.
Sure. So, and this will, Katie, does it work out that everybody got to ask a question if we end on this one?
We have one more after this one.
Okay, sure. Well, I'll power through this one, and Mark, if you have any comments, but COVID, when we went into a state of emergency, which we are still in, the mayor has extended the state of emergency, and the NACA recommendations of emergency only intake came out. I forwarded that to the COO and the city attorney and the mayor, and was given a green light to move forward. Hopefully the person who asked this question has heard tonight that that is not our long-term plan. It is not what we plan to continue doing. It was in response to a declared state of emergency. You know, it may not be as obvious as a hurricane or a flood or a tornado, but it was a declared state of emergency, and it was in direct response to that. I don't want to change the ordinance to say that we don't have that role anymore long term. I do want to make some modifications to our ordinance, which I've actually worked on and was getting ready to bring to city council right before COVID hit. And then obviously priorities got shifted. But those ordinance revisions do not address this or say we're just not going to pick up strays anymore. This was a exemption to the ordinance as written based on a declared state of emergency.
Yeah, I've also helped, you know, in a lot of these similar situations. And I think the thing is that you want to have a little bit of common sense discretion when it comes to this kind of work, because if you follow the letter of the law of what that ordinance, what I heard from that ordinance, what it said is, even if I was running and I was coming to respond to a loose dog and it was running and I picked it up and the owner was right behind it, if I went to the letter of the law of that ordinance, I would just say, sorry, you know, you're going to have to drive, go to the shelter, pay your impound fees and get that animal. That makes no sense. That is not a good community service. So I would recommend exactly what Alexis is doing and manage up, be very open and transparent with kind of where we want to have some discretion, and think about where we can amend ordinances where it's not like we don't ever do this, but that gives us a little bit of discretion to be better community servants.
Yeah, I mean, there's even a part of that, like the second part of that clause, because I've dug deep into those ordinances. The second part of that clause actually says any animal not wearing a current rabies tag shall be impounded and brought to the shelter, and doesn't even account for the idea of if the dog's running at large. It just says if it doesn't have a current tag on, I shall impound it and bring it to the shelter, even if it's in someone's backyard. So to your point, I think that there was some well-intentioned people who drafted those ordinances, but it's time for some progress. We were about to go there, and unfortunately COVID pushed that back, but we are, as soon as we have a moment to breathe, we're going to get back to that ordinance revision and try to bring some of that more progressive thought process forward. So, all right, Katie, we can wrap up with one last question.
Okay, regarding the San Antonio ACS study, their study doesn't seem to mention any change in their field intake policy other than deferring microchip dogs to their rightful homes in the field rather than doing so at the shelter. How are you able to justify a shift in intake policy that could potentially endanger roaming and stray animals rather than just increasing pet owner education and assistance?
Okay. Mark, I'm going to actually let you start on that one since it's about another city and you probably are more familiar with it than I am.
Yeah, Katie, can you repeat it one more time? I didn't hear all of the question. I'm so sorry to waste time answering it, but
regarding the San Antonio ACS study, I'm not sure what ACS stands for. Their study does not seem to mention any change in their field intake policy other than deferring microchipped dogs to their rightful homes in the field rather than doing so at the shelter. How are you able to justify a shift in intake policy that could potentially endanger roaming and stray animals rather than just increasing pet owner education and assistance?
well, and the one thing I will tell you about, San Antonio is that, they are, and they've opened, and you referenced the things that are good about, some of the changes and some of the things that they're doing, but astutely, a lot of their approach still in certain areas of the city tend to be a bit more punitive, and that's what we're trying, what Alexis is really kind of talking about and trying to actually incorporate to also make it a full success measure. There's a lot of citations that are still written in San Antonio from the last time that I visited. There's a lot of progress. They're doing a great job of keeping up with the level of animals coming into their shelters. However, we actually continue to work with San Antonio because there needs to be a little bit more of what we're kind of talking about here, and really kind of emphasizing the fact that not always going and giving certain areas, especially low-income areas, tickets is the right way to kind of approach and really help the animal and the people in this community out. So it's not a perfect situation in San Antonio, but they're doing a great job of life-saving there. They're making a lot of step forward in regards to how they're using microchips to identify returning from the field and those kind of things. But I would say, what is being presented in this community is what we and other national organizations that you saw, and we, just like every other animal agency, there's a lot of things that we don't agree on. We in Unison agree on this approach, whether it's Humane Society of the United States, the SPCA, Best Friends, whomever. It's really about being more of an active and proactive member of your community and really trying to help people. You obviously still need to write tickets. You obviously still need to investigate cruelty. But there are situations where you're using common sense discretion, again, to figure out what is going to be best for the community members and the animals, and to help us, prioritize and really make sure that the services are being provided. So intake in regards to, and again, I think Alexis has said this a few times, it is not about not going out and picking up stray animals when they're needed, especially if they're in danger, they're running on highways or those kind of things. But it really is incorporating a little bit more common sense in regards to roaming animals. One, again, they're almost always owned, if not always owned. And two, when is it an appropriate time, when they're healthy, when they're okay, to not always just go and impound them and take them in and return them in the field and provide, community resource and some help and learning to ultimately, evolve the community and keeping those pets a little bit safer. Hopefully that addresses what you're asking, but Alexis, please, if you have anything to add.
Well, the only thing would be is again, I hope that we've provided some clarity tonight about we're not creating a revised intake policy. We're adding services to more individually address each individual pet owner. And I'll just kind of close with what I think is a really great analogy that my boss, Chief McGowan, has actually had me doing some investigation on and working with, which is our EMS program here in Memphis. So the fire department runs our EMS, and they started this program called Radar, and it's an acronym for something, I don't know. But the idea being that it used to be a you call, we haul mentality to ambulances, right? So you call 911, you call, we're going with an ambulance. Well, what did that do? It caused overutilization and overcapacity in the emergency room. At times, there were true high priority emergencies, high acuity needs, and no ambulances available because they were tied up on low acuity calls. And so they built this program where they said one size doesn't fit all. So now if you call and it's a lower acuity, let's say you fell in your house and you just need a lift call, well, they're going to send an SUV with a nurse practitioner on board to provide some resources on site and then set you up with an outpatient appointment the next day. So it's the idea of, can we be more strategic about what solution we throw at a problem instead of the one-size-fits-all approach that we used to have in animal welfare. We had very little disparity in how we handled every single call. And I ask people to think back to this. Think back to every Disney movie you've ever seen. It's a mean dude with a catch pole, right? One of those rabies control poles. Nobody's walking around with leashes in those because the image was, friendly or not, you're getting a dog with a catch pole, you're wrangling them in, you're throwing them on a truck, and you're going. That's not the vision of animal control that I want for my daughter. In fact, I cover her eyes when she watches these Disney movies or these cartoons that portray us in such a negative light. I want to work in an industry that says we provide the solution that is right for that animal and that person to achieve the ultimate goal, which is ending shelter killing, and which is making sure that pets in our community have what they need to live a happy, healthy lives, and that the people in our community are safe. And we all want those three things. I don't think there's a person on this call or in the world that can say, I don't want to end the killing of healthy shelter pets. I want to see pets living good, happy, quality lives, and I want people to be safe. We all want the same thing. It's about exploring solutions and being willing to try. And that's what this is about. We're going to try because we've got to try. The effort is worth it. The effort is worth it to save these lives. So I'm going to end there. I'm going to say a huge thank you to Mark Peralta from his attic in Rhode Island, folks. We are so lucky to have him today. Any follow-up questions that you have today, feel free to email me at alexis.pugh@memphistn.gov. This recording will be available on our website probably tomorrow, if not tomorrow on Monday. And this is an ongoing conversation. So if you have thoughts, if you have ideas, if you have solutions you want us to consider, we want to hear from you. And certainly we hope that all of you, like the wonderful woman who engaged and said she'd like to help, we hope that all of you will be a part of this, making this solution a reality, and we can save the animals in our community successfully together. So thank you all. Have a wonderful Thursday night. Appreciate your time. Bye all.